Hey, everybody, welcome to another great LinkedIn Live. I'm really excited about this month's LinkedIn Live. Last month we had Marshall Allen on talking about his book, talking about some issues involving fraud, waste, and abuse. We don't normally have lawyers, attorneys. We don't normally have those kinds of people on our LinkedIn Lives. But this month, I thought it'd be a good idea to have David Blank come on and spend some time with us on this month's LinkedIn Live. David and I have known each other for probably about 15 years. He was an attorney in-house with OIG at the Office of Counsel to the Inspector General and went on to private practice a few years ago. And, at some point, David and I, anytime I had an administrative case under the civil monetary penalties law, I worked really just with David. He was like my go-to AUSA on the OCIG side. And I got to work with him for many, many years. And like anybody, when you're working with someone for a long time, you kind of understand the things that they're looking for when they're looking to decide whether they're going to work on a case or not. And so it was a great, we had a great time. We worked on a lot of good things. And David has now been in private practice for a number of years, and he works criminal and civil cases and just a variety of things in the healthcare space. So David, I'm super excited to have you. I talked to you a lot more about non-work things than work things, so it's nice to chat with you about some work things. But let's just introduce yourself, talk a little about where you came from, where you are, what your practice entails, and then let's get going. We got a lot to talk about.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you lifting the non-lawyer policy, which I would, other than today, I agree it should be implemented in more places. But excited to be here. As Eric was saying, I had spent 11 years with the OIG, doing almost exclusively the enforcement side of the OIG work portfolio. Spent 3 years as a deputized SAUSA or Special Assistant United States Attorney bringing criminal cases. Since my time with the government has ended, been in private practice the past 5 years. My practice is, I'd say 50-50 between kind of the front end compliance counseling, regulatory guidance and advice part of the legal world. And then the other half is the after the fact enforcement investigation and government parallel or internal investigations that companies oftentimes need when there's a compliance breakdown. And that's been great. And essentially, any type of client in the Part A, B, C, or D space, and it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, and we've worked, and since you've gone to private practice, and since I retired from the OIG, we've worked on a couple of things together. And I will say you're not afraid to take some of these complex matters that I think a lot of people would shy away from. I know we worked on a couple of things involving some pharmaceutical dispensing related issues and number of units and things of that, like, super complex things. And I think, we've been able to help you. We have some really great data analysts on our end and just that subject matter expertise, and then throw in your subject matter expertise. And it really does make things go a little bit smoother. But, I know you a lot of your focus, and particularly a lot of your focus when you were at OCIG, was really, on the regulatory stuff. And so I really want to focus a lot on how the regulations impact providers and the importance of being compliant from that regulatory perspective. And the one thing that I really want to spend some time about is, 2010, the Affordable Care Act comes out. And what a lot of people don't know is that there was a huge body of regulatory guidance that came out that was separate from setting up the healthcare exchange. Setting up the healthcare exchange or the marketplace or whatever you want to call it was just one aspect of what wound up being, thousands of pages of regulatory information. And the one thing that, kind of stands out for us from a compliance perspective and from a fraud, waste, abuse compliance perspective, which parlays into the OIG's kind of 7-point model compliance guidance, is what's kind of colloquially known as the 60-day rule, right? So David, help clear up the myth on the 60-day rule, which isn't, as anything in government goes, the 60-day rule isn't really 60 days, it's more. And kind of what is the 60-day rule and what does it all mean?
Yeah, it's another one of those examples of just a, well-intentioned rule, terrible name, and was open to a lot of misinterpretation, particularly earlier. So you really look at the regulation in two phases. You had the pre-CMS final rule guidance, which was helpful, where everyone's trying to figure out what returning or identifying and returning an overpayment within 60 days really meant. And then you have that post-final rule where everyone is looking at that preamble and trying to figure out, all right, the CMS has recognized the need for investigative time before this 60-day rule comes in. How much time is appropriate? What do you actually have to do to essentially quantify and return that within the appropriate period of time? But as you're saying, bad name. It's really the 6 months plus your 60 days, unless this is complex, and then there's reasons to extend it. So it really is a bit of a sliding scale, but if you take kind of a holistic view of what the government wants providers to do when there is a regulatory breakdown, it is they want you to engage in a good faith and diligent effort to determine what the problem was, the size and scope of it, and then return the money to the applicable payer, or if your internal shows up something different, you may have to go to a different agency, perhaps OIG, perhaps DOJ. But the primary obligation is to understand what happened and figure out how big a problem is.
So it's interesting because anybody who is a participating provider in the Medicare program, so they've completed what's known as the 855 form, they've gotten a provider number, and they are able to submit claims to the program, that there is a rule that says, and commercial payers have this because you can see it in their network agreements, is if you identify an overpayment, you must make that overpayment, right? It's a fact of the program. So, right, if you have a robust internal compliance program and you've identified an overpayment through self-auditing, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but you've identified an overpayment, you have to make that overpayment. So it was interesting when the Affordable Care Act came out with what's called as the 60-day rule, when there was already kind of a rule in place that says you have to make this payment. And I think where people get a little confused or they get flustered is the fact that it's 60 days from identifying the issue, plus you get the 6 months to do your due diligence. But then if there are complexities, you can take longer. So, the question that gets posed quite often is, if I go to make an overpayment at 7 months and 29 days versus 8 months and 1 day, ostensibly, am I punished by making my overpayment 1 day over that, what really comes out to be the 8-month mark? Or is there a benefit by doing it at 7 months and 29 days, right? It kind of becomes a debate that people have.
Well, I will say, look, the general rule of thumb is you should always assume that there is a benefit to complying with a rule that CMS or OIG has put out there. So if there's an opportunity to meet the deadline, you want to do that. But I think where this issue comes into play, I mean, yes, there was always an obligation to return overpayment pre-ACA, but the way that the oversight and the regulatory framework is now woven together is that the failure to do this in the timely fashion can not only, do you not have the remaining, or you have the remaining overpayment exposure, but you get additional exposure for failing to comply with this 60-day rule, which is potential CMP, potential False Claims Act exposure. So there are a whole host of ancillary statutes in the enforcement space that take a overpayment problem, which has no scienter, it can be negligence or mistake that drives it, and all of a sudden you have a known civil money penalty or False Claims Act problem because you didn't do anything about that, or at least you didn't act in the time that CMS had said you were required to do so. So right. Yeah, that's a big carrot and stick right there.
Right. So what you're really talking about is this kind of like reckless disregard, right? Like, hey, I'm going to get around to it when I get around to it. The Affordable Care Act, or ACA, is saying you've got 8 months, you've got 6 months to do your investigation and come up with what you think is the overpayment, and be able to do that without the potential of there being collateral implications. But once you've passed that 8-month mark, if you try to make that overpayment, there may be collateral implications like what took you so long, right? And the argument is going to be, well, it was a complex matter, and you'd have to obviously be able to prove something to be able to demonstrate that. Now, while we're still on that topic, so we're talking about overpayments. And overpayments are just the single damages, we'll call that, right? Just the amount that was part of that overpayment. There's a lot of ways that can be calculated. And we're going to get into next will be this kind of talk about the self-disclosure protocol. But obviously, when you've identified a problem that results in an overpayment, you've got to come up with a methodology that's a sound methodology that is going to go back to a claim. Because I think the one thing that sometimes becomes the issue is when you're doing an overpayment, you've got to be able to tie back that dollar amount to the specific claim. Because on the Medicare side, they've got to go back and kind of do this credit debit thing, right? It's kind of like if you got a refund check for something, you got to be able to know what's my refund check for. And so there's obviously a number of different ways to kind of figure that out. One of them is obviously statistical sampling, where you can do that. But how does, in a statistical sample, you're only taking a representative sample and then doing an extrapolation. How do those two mesh together when you're talking about coming up with what that overpayment is going to be?
Well, that's, the sampling part kind of almost first starts with the identification of the overpayment, because oftentimes it takes a little bit of time to first realize that there actually is a problem. And just identifying the universe of claims that fit within that can often start with a sample in and of itself. Because unless you have absolute clarity into the issue, oftentimes you're trying to figure out what the parameters are of the actual claims that are affected before you even begin that quantification process. And so, a lot of times clients reach out and working with them. This is a tough issue because, CMS, the expectation is if you have one claim that is subject to an overpayment, you have an obligation to return. That's what the preamble says.
Right.
Now, how are you as a provider supposed to be confident enough that you have captured just one claim and there's not two or three or four? And so it really takes, I think, a disciplined approach, and it has to be a thoughtful approach at the beginning to say, these are the type of things that we might be looking for to determine a potential regulatory violation or not. And so the design on the front end, not only is it going to help when you quantify, but how big of a problem is this? Because if it is small, and sometimes it is, let's say, I don't know, a provider's on vacation and somebody bills in the office as if they were in there rendering a service. All right, well, you can set parameters as here is the start and the end of the vacation. Well, you don't need to sample that. You have defined terms, you can look at it, and if there's a provider number associated with it, and assuming that, we'll assume it was just coded in error, maybe there's an opportunity to resubmit and correct, or if it's an overpayment, you can collect that within the window they were gone. I'll say they're really never that easy. It's always how long, when does it start? Because if you don't know when it started, how big is the universe? I mean, do you start at the 6-year statute of limitation for civil money penalty law violation? Do you go back 10 years because in some situations that's how far back the False Claims Act can go? Do you go back 3 years on a Medicaid look back window? All of these things have to be mapped out in advance before you get to how do we quantify the problem. And then assuming you meet all of the criteria, you have your design, then the question becomes, do we do the full claim review or do we sample? And if we're going to sample, how do we do it? And with large providers, a full claim review is virtually impossible.
Well, so just to kind of parlay on that, because one of the things that you're talking about is sort of the order of things, right? So you think you have a problem, you've got to do your internal investigation first to kind of figure out what that problem is,
and this is
and
that
then do your
6-month window.
And then do your sampling later, and then you come up with, with that number, right? Whether it's a defined amount of time or whatever it is, right? So that becomes that challenge, and that's where, right, in large provider groups, like statistical sampling is the only way to do it. If it's a 2-provider practice and we're talking about one billing for the other on vacation, I mean, that's not, but once you get beyond, just that small group practice, and you're talking about these larger entities, statistical sampling is really the way that it's got to be done. And the one thing that you brought up is this whole premise of, if you've got one bad claim, you've got to report that as an overpayment. And not that I want to get too far off topic, but for a very long time under corporate integrity agreements, OIG took the position that if your error rate on your statistical sampling was below 5%, there wasn't a requirement to report. There was a requirement to make the overpayment. I think there's a big difference. There was a requirement. You always have to make an overpayment. It could be $1, it could be $1 billion. There was a requirement to make an overpayment, whether you're under a CIA or not. But there had historically been the premise that if your error rate on your corporate integrity agreement sampling was below 5%, it was not considered to be a reportable event. But more recently, OCIG has taken the position that any identified overpayment is a reportable event. So, what this kind of does is this kind of sets good, bad, or indifferent, but it sort of sets this alignment that if you had to report an overpayment as an overpayment to the program, these corporate integrity agreements kind of kept it consistent. I think the rub is going to be, as a result of having one bad claim, and the craziness is that one bad claim could have been, like, literally, it could have been a 99211 service with a nurse, which reimburses like $20-30, that becomes a reportable event, which then puts the provider in the position of kind of having a moment of, oh my God, is this going to create a violation? Am I breaching my corporate integrity agreement? So, it doesn't mean that the rules change, but it certainly does put you on notice that if you've got overpayments, you've got to identify them. Does that identification require 6 months or 8 months? Does it require an intensive, discussion? But when you're having discussions with your clients, and look, you and I have worked on some self-disclosure work. We've done some of the stuff on the 60-day. When you're having conversations with your clients, are you getting them in the headspace of, we've got to work to get this done as quickly as possible? Like, you cannot lollygag about these things.
Yes. And, every provider that I work with, and I assume, everyone out here listening today is resource strapped. I mean, compliance departments are stretched fairly thin to begin with. And you add on something like a substantial internal claim review and statistical analysis and sampling, it has the ability to break the system. Because of the amount of work required to do that initial lift. And so that is, always a hard part attention, that you don't want to draw resources away from existing compliance matters and concerns, because that is, you're just going to lead to another scenario where you have to do this again. But marshaling the resources to get it done in a timely fashion is important. And I will tell you that 8-month window, that comes up very fast. Particularly it's never going to go smoothly. There's always going to be an issue with the data. There'll always be, a problem that surfaces that is unexpected. And, if you're not on the front end, you end up rushing on the backside. And that is a problem, particularly, if you have multiple places that you need to do these returns, or you have a significant number of claims that have to be identified for the payer in order to reverse them. That is not an easy step.
Right.
But the biggest carrot, and I will tell you, this is early when I left the OIG, I was working with a client, and, despite, my general awareness of this, never truly appreciated the importance of diligence in that, the 6-month window, because a couple months in, very close, got a CID. And guess what? All of a sudden, we went from this, is it an overpayment? Maybe it's a self-disclosure. I don't know.
Right.
And now all of a sudden it's in False Claims Act world. And I tell that story to every client who engaged in that process, to say, yes, there are a lot of things that need to be done, but none of that is worse than having to go through an FCA investigation where you were going to return the overpayment, or you're going to self-disclose to the government, and you don't get that option anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the point is well taken, because the issue on resource allocation is an important one. I mean, I know, we've worked on a few projects here with outside counsel like yourself, where the provider they don't have the resources. They just give it to us to do everything soup to nuts, because they just don't have those resources. And you're right, some of these can be complex, particularly, and you and I have talked about this offline a number of times, the cases that are the Part A and Part B cases. Well, the payer's right here. Right. And we've talked about this on the Part D side. The Part D side is the biggest challenge, because if you have an instance in which you've got hundreds of different Part D plans out there, trying to identify all of those plans and who gets the money and in the order in which they get it. It is a huge challenge. And as you know, because we've talked about this as well, particularly when we're talking about things on the Part D side, and we could talk about this for hours, involving coupons and copay, is the fact that the plans use what they call the BIN and PCN combinations. A lot of them mirror commercial payers. And so do you even really know that the plan is a Medicare plan, right? And so these add in, and I don't want to go too far off topic, but these are the things that create that timeliness, that you may not be able to do something. 8 months seems like a lifetime, but 8 months may just be scratching the surface on something that is inordinately complex, right? So you've got the kind of that timeliness of the pushing and the pulling. But so I want to jump, because before we run out of time, you brought up this this great point about how you're a couple of months into your internal investigation, you get a CID, and it's like, oh boy. But at the end of the day, that doesn't knock you out of the prospect of doing a self-disclosure, because under the self-disclosure rules, as long as you can demonstrate that you've got some good faith effort, that you were in the process of doing something, you might not be excluded. And I'll give you my example. Is I was working on a project with a doctor who had about a $2 million liability. Actual criminal behavior was billing for services not rendered, billing for medically unnecessary services, and was breaking out claims for things that he did and using other people's NPIs so he wouldn't be an outlier. Like literally a week before we had the self-disclosure written up, and literally a week before we were making the disclosure, we got a notification from the UPIC for records and that the provider was under investigation. And we made our self-disclosure, and we got a letter about a week after we made the self-disclosure from the UPIC telling us not to give the records. We understand you've been put into the self-disclosure protocol. But the point of this, which is important, is that getting that CID raises the bar. But when we're talking about moving this into a self-disclosure, and obviously when you get a CID, that should give you pause to think, hey, maybe we should be thinking in terms of that the end result isn't going to be an overpayment under the Affordable Care Act, but that we're going to do a self-disclosure. So I want to talk a little bit about self-disclosures, and for those that don't fully deal with this, whatever, right? The OIG, as I'm showing on my screen, the OIG has a website, and we're going to throw this into the chat so you can take a look. But there are a number of disclosures that you can make under the OIG self-disclosure protocol. The one that people are most, I think, conversant with is the one for healthcare fraud, which is your provider one. But recently, and this is as of 2022, there was some changes to the protocol. Contractors and grantees can do it. The biggest change that I saw was the fact that it's now an entirely web-based submission. You can't write a letter and do it on hard copy. It kind of goes in. But so let's talk about that transition. That you've done your investigation, right? In your case, the provider got a CID. That obviously raises the specter that maybe this needs to be a self-disclosure, and that decision is going to be made. There are a lot of different types of self-disclosures. OIG is just one. It's the one I think people know most commonly. OIG's got a self-disclosure protocol, but there's an actual carve-out that if there's a strictly Stark related self-disclosure, that has to go to CMS. And then, of course, DOJ has one for criminal cases. So, when you're talking to your clients about the prospect of a self-disclosure, at the end of the day, it's ultimately the client's decision about whether they just want to see what happens or what they want to do. But let's talk about what are those benefits of self-disclosures, and what do you recommend to providers who are maybe on the fence about what to do?
Well, I think this is actually one of the pieces of the internal inquiry for the overpayment response. Everyone's so focused on quantifying and returning. Oftentimes, people forget to analyze the reasons why there's an overpayment in the first place, because it's really a separate analysis to determine whether the underlying conduct has given rise to, FCA or CMPL liability. So, it's not just you have to get this money back, but the review should do kind of the root cause analysis to determine whether this is something that gives rise to a should have known knowledge standard. And if that's the case, you can hit your overpayment report and return deadline, and you still have exposure under the law. So, understanding that the framework is more than just quantifying and returning, but it is addressing the conduct to determine whether you have additional legal risk. That's an important piece. But if there is an identified risk, the benefit of disclosing, and look, the OIG is the kind of the gold standard for that process. It has been around, I believe, since 1999. And the CMS Stark disclosure process, the DOJ criminal self-disclosure process, a lot of them have incorporated these types of programs based on the success of OIG. So it is really one of the great things that the agency does. And I won't always give them credit there, but this is one that works well. And
Right.
the benefit is substantial. So most people know that the biggest benefit is a monetary reduction in terms of the multiplier. So you said, single damages. That's OIG vocabulary right there. Single damages also means the overpayment. But when you're looking at a potential resolution in a self-disclosure case, or FCA case, there's always a multiplier. OIG and DOJ in the FCA cases, the traditional multiplier is 2 to 3 times the overpayment, or what Eric and I call the single damages figure. Self-disclosure protocol has a significant carrot, and that is 0.5. So if you have $1 million overpayment, your exposure through the self-disclosure protocol, absent outrageous and very unusual circumstances, you will get that monetary benefit, and your resolution will be 1.5 million. Versus something between 2 to 3, and for mid-sized providers, that's a big difference.
Sure. Yeah, and look, and I think the issue is that you cannot use the self-disclosure protocol for submissions relating to an issue where you think it was an error or a mistake or something like that, right? There's got to be some liability that you would have been exposed to, and I think that in some instances, providers might want to go into the self-disclosure protocol with the thought of, well, I'll pay a little bit more money to not have to be bothered with this. And I think that, that's part of it. Now, obviously, one of the collateral benefits of getting into the self-disclosure protocol is that you will not be the subject generally. OIG always reserves its rights, but generally you won't have to enter into a corporate integrity agreement or a provider integrity agreement, CIA or PIA, because you're obviously doing something that is a positive, right? You're disclosing your behavior, and so giving someone a PIA or a CIA is essentially a belt and suspenders approach to someone who's already done something from a compliant perspective. But I think the one piece that always I think providers tend to not fully understand is that your release is only with respect to OIG related matters. You do not get a release from criminal liability because the OIG is not the DOJ, and the only people that can give a release from criminal liability is the U.S. Department of Justice. And so I think in some instances, and I hear this a lot from providers when I'm doing work, they bring us in and they'll say, well, Eric, you were an OIG agent, you worked with the U.S. Attorney's Office, you worked with DOJ. What are the chances of, when we do this self-disclosure, what are the chances of DOJ coming in and prosecuting us? Because there is nothing that protects you, right? And I don't know, and you and I talk about this a lot, right?
Yeah, no, look, there's a leap of faith. I mean, there is a component of that to the disclosure process. I am unaware of any case that has gone to a good faith disclosure where there has been a corresponding and subsequent criminal investigation. Look, I have been part of, I've submitted disclosures to the OIG and then received a call from the Department of Justice saying that they were already looking at that, and it was accepted into the protocol, but I've been dealing with the Department of Justice ever since on it. So there are parallels there. Thankfully, it's civil. And I think that the important side is, if you truly think that there is criminal exposure, you have to think long and hard about the appropriate play. Because you said that a lot. Sometimes providers say, "Oh, I'll just submit this to the disclosure. I'll get the benefit of the release, and I have a little peace of mind." But part of disclosing requires you to affirmatively certify to a violation of the civil money penalty law, which in a broad sense will always mirror some sort of criminal statute out there. There will be a criminal statute parallel. And how comfortable are you making that certification to OIG if, is that an admission? It's, these are the type of conversations and questions you have. And it is, there is no good answer. There is no easy way out of those situations.
Right.
But it's been my experience that the government has an expectation, if you are an enrolled provider, that you will do the right thing. And disclosing goes a very long way in allowing somebody like myself to argue this person understands and is willing to do the right thing.
Right.
And that's actually who I can't say that about.
But that's an important point, because one of the things that we've talked about with some of our clients when working with law firms is that one of the things that the U.S. Attorney's Office also has to look at in these kinds of cases is what's the jury appeal. The jury appeal of the government having to get up and tell a jury the only reason that we're prosecuting this person is because they told on themselves. There wasn't already a criminal case on them. They came forward and they admitted their liability, and they had a compliance plan in place that caught this, and they said, hey, we have this problem, we have to fix it. There's a little bit of a jury appeal discussion that has to go on with that to say, hey, this may not be a real sexy case. Why would a prosecutor want to deal with something that's already being resolved? And by the way, the person who made the self-disclosure discovered the problem, stopped the problem, created an action plan, right? A corrective action plan, and then moved on from this. So, that's a piece of it. And I know, you and I have done some presentations together, and you had a slide deck that goes back to when you were at the OIG, where you talked about the different types of self-disclosures, right? You do one to CMS, you do one to OIG, you do one to DOJ. And the question that's often asked is, what's the best one to do? Now, for CMS, it can only be a Stark violation. And if there is a Stark violation, you cannot make that to the OIG. It has to go to CMS. But if we're talking about what would be, a violation of the anti-kickback statute, healthcare fraud, false claims, where maybe they want to make a DOJ or maybe they want to make an OIG self-disclosure, it kind of is an individual weighing of the facts. Is the behavior so criminal that you fear that there's going to be some independent criminal investigation or not? And I think, and you were criminal and civil, that becomes a tough decision, right? To help advise a client on.
It is. And I've been in situations where people knew that there was a grand jury kind of circulating around their business, and they've come in at that point in time and said, let's self-disclose. Look, that's not the time. It just isn't. But there are certainly situations where, it's a difficult call to say what is a Civil False Claims Act violation and what makes a good criminal case. I can't believe it took this long for me to say it depends, but that's the answer. It's going to be talking to folks like Eric, talking to folks like myself, to say historically this is the type of thing that garners this type of response, whether it be criminal or FCA or civil, and there are certain types of cases. If you have employed an excluded person, there's no debate or question. You go to the OIG with them. They are best suited to handle that. Questions of kickback, look, it is by itself a criminal statute. So if you are reporting a kickback violation to anybody, you are, in essence, the disclosure requires you to admit to a criminal offense. So that is, something that has to be mixed into the calculus.
Yeah, and it really is a challenge, but I think that in every self-disclosure that I've worked on here at Advise over the past 4.5 years now, the one thing that I've readily recognized is that every provider has said, we did this, it was wrong, we understand that it was wrong, we need to fix this problem, we're not doing it again, here's our corrective action plan. And it's that falling on the sword is what sometimes makes that, kind of discernible difference. Look, I think, when providers have identified a problem, the first thing is stop the bleeding. And the second thing is to immediately identify who the right consultants and law firm is going to be, because you can't do this on your own. And it's actually better that you give it to someone else so the fox isn't watching the hen house, right? Because this is all going to fall back to what I said in the very beginning. 2010, the Affordable Care Act gets passed. And one of the requirements under the Affordable Care Act is that every provider in the Medicare Medicaid program has to have a compliance plan. I can't tell you how many providers I've spoken to that have zero compliance plans. And a lot of times it's a 1 or 2 doctor shop, and the response that they give, and it's terrible, but the response that they always give is, well, my wife, my husband, my girl, whatever, nonsense they want to say, they do the billing, it's no big deal, whatever it is. And it's like, but who's checking to make sure that your stuff is 100% right? So it becomes this full circle that if you started off with a good compliance plan to begin with, that included robust self-auditing by a third party, and you had a good compliance plan that was put together by competent healthcare regulatory people, and going online and pulling down from the internet a model compliance plan that's been put up online in Word is not the answer, because compliance plans are living, breathing documents. And I know you do a ton of work with that kind of stuff, that you've got to have a compliance plan that evolves and changes, in which all of these things come out, including reporting overpayments, self-disclosures, and the like, And so I want to give you the last thought, 2 things. One, the first one is, what's the biggest pushback that you get from your clients when you're giving them advice about something in this regulatory space? That's my first question. And then as the press, when they're over at the White House and they say you only get 1 question, and they say it's 1 question, but it's 7 parts. My other one is, with all of the stuff that's coming out from a regulatory perspective, changes in things like data blocking and the like, what do you see as being kind of the next big areas over the next few years from the regulatory landscape?
Yeah, so look, the most common pushback is it's a resource one. I think that is the response that we get for the most part. And, this is kind of that the penny wise, pound foolish approach to, I think, a regulatory problem. I've seen enough and have enough, war stories and examples where I think I can effectively convey that. But it is taking these, situations seriously. And look, as you said, if you have an opportunity to catch this before there is an identified issue, you want everyone to be proactive. That is, without a doubt, the investment return you get from doing that is substantial. But just approaching it with the mindset that you have to be serious about these obligations, because if not, it's only a matter of time before you get a different type of government touch. And I can tell you from experience, it's not ideal. To the second part, where do I see this going? Look, it's going to be more oversight. It's going to be more rules. I think the recent 21st Century CARES Act, you mentioned the information blocking. CMP the OIG has a brand new CMPL authority. It goes live, I think, this month. This is it. It goes live now, so it is live. Information blocking is going to be, I think, a piece of the OIG enforcement portfolio on a go-forward basis. And I think you're going to see a lot in the grant fraud area, because HHS is the largest grant-making agency in the government. There is money everywhere, and now there is more resources than ever before putting behind this. We need to enforce how these tax dollars are spent on the grant and research side. So that will continue as well. Both of those are new cutting edge kind of enforcement areas. And, it certainly has the provider community's attention.
Yeah, I know, and we talk about this on our regular advice podcast, the OIG Roundtable. We always talk about the changing landscape of priorities, and grants have always kind of been there. And, we kind of lament when we're doing our roundtable about it'll be July or August. There's 1 or 2 months left in the fiscal year, and all of a sudden an email would come out that would say, hey, you're low on your grant work. You've got to start doing more grant cases. And I always joke about the one Head Start case that one of the agents in the office where I worked in New Jersey had. It was the most well investigated case because everybody needed to work on it. But it is true, and there is a self-disclosure protocol for grants, and it is going to be a thing. And I think the one thing, just to talk about grants for a second, is when all that money came out from the public health emergency, all that money went through HRSA, and that money it's essentially grant money. It was really unrestricted grant money that HRSA was managing. And I always joke that before COVID, I always thought that HRSA was an organization involving, it had two people that were in the basement of the Cohen building with no windows. And then all of a sudden somebody shows up with a money truck and says, here, my friends, start giving this out. And the two people were like, what? You know, what's going on? So yeah, I think these are big topics. The information blocking piece is going to be a big piece of it. Office of the National Coordinator was relying very heavily upon the Office of Civil Rights within HHS for enforcement, and that was not a huge office either. They were dealing that previously their big issue was HIPAA violations. That was what they pretty much did. So now that there's this new authority, I could see. I think the vacancy announcements for the Office of Counsel to the Inspector General will come out because they're going to hire people to just kind of do that work. So
it's real now. They have dedicated attorneys. I know of at least two in each silo, the information blocking and then two in the grant fraud. They're out there looking. And so it's, if you are taking money from HHS, and you'd be surprised, if you look at how your funding streams come in, you might be,
right.
You have to understand what that means. And it's not the same thing as, we're just submitting claims for Part B reimbursement. It is an entirely different animal.
Right. And people need to understand, in the OCIG world, at least, there's a new sheriff in town. The former chief is now gone, retired, went into private practice. There's a new set of leadership there. And with new leadership comes shaking of the tree, which means new priorities, new investments in things, good, bad, or indifferent. That's just kind of the cycle of it, right? When
they have the new litigation team, there's an entire unit that is essentially kind of a mini DOJ main justice type. That's all they do.
Right.
And, they need to show that it's a worthwhile investment from the oversight side. So yeah, there are going to be cases because the cases are out there and they have people looking.
And you will see them. And I saw them recently. I had a project I did where an OE&I study resulted in referrals to OCIG for CMP cases. And the 4 or 5 providers that got caught up in that OE&I study were treated very differently than everybody else where there was an identified overpayment. And that's just the landscape that there is. I think people are tired of fraud in one way, shape, or another. They're tired of fraud, waste, and abuse, and they're wondering, why isn't anything being done? And so we're going to see some of these tectonic shifts that come out. But look, we talked about a lot of things, and a lot of those things are things that providers can do to really work to be compliant. You said it. It's not a matter of if you get reviewed or audited, or it's a matter of when that comes. And, it's a matter of being able to put your head on the pillow at night, knowing that you've done the best you can to, do these things. Proactive audits, a good compliance plan, competent external compliance people to help you with that, and knowing you got to stay in that driver's seat for as long as you can. It just is an ongoing conversation. We could talk about things like this for hours. I mean, it's just kind of the way it is. So, as always, it's good to talk to you. It's good to see you. It's good to hang out with you on these things. These LinkedIn Lives are, I think, a great way to connect up with people again. So for all of you that have taken the time out of your day, I want to thank you for clicking on and joining this LinkedIn Live. We've got a whole bunch coming up here in the future. Again, if you're not getting our newsletter, which every week comes out on Fridays, send us an email, hello@advisehealth.com. We'll get you signed up for the newsletter. Our OIG Roundtable recordings are on there. Our previous LinkedIn Lives are also available through Spotify and through our YouTube channel. You can get them there. So as always, we want to thank you for taking the time. David, as always, thanks for your insight and thanks for participating. We'll see you on the next LinkedIn Live.